Uh, Rector, Ambassador Prata, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, fellow academics, colleagues, and friends, thank you very much for being with us today for this book discussion. And today we are going to talk about a book, and this is the book, by the way. And we are going to be talking about the writings of Johannes Nieuhof, and why I think this book deserves a rereading today. Nieuhof's work has been largely forgotten in this part of the world. And as Pak Rector himself has said, even in Indonesia, many Indonesians may not be familiar with the man and his work and his writings. What I'd like to do today is basically talk a bit about Nieuhof himself, the context of the writing, what is contained in his writing, and why I believe this work is actually important and relevant for us, particularly today. And the timing, as Ambassador Prata noted, is actually important because things are afoot. Indonesia's entry into BRICS, welcomed by Brazil, I think somehow makes this work relevant in our context today. So let me just start about the book itself. Nieuhof, of course, was a Dutchman. The book that you have before you is actually William Churchill's English translation that was translated and published several decades later. So this is the 1744 edition. Yes, it's quite old, although Nieuhof's original work, of course, was written in the 1680s. So who is Johannes Nieuhof? Nieuhof, for me, in so many ways, is what you would call a modern man. Is modern in the sense that he is a product of the historical circumstances that made him who he was, and he's not an ordinary traveler because he is fundamentally a colonial merchant who worked for the VOC, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, the Dutch East Indies Company. During the course of his career, Nieuhof was a prolific writer as well, not just a merchant and a trader, but also a writer who documented the societies that he interacted with. And actually, his writing on Brazil was published as one volume. His writings on Java were published in another volume. What's interesting about the English Churchill edition is that it brings them together. I would like to point out here that Nieuhof doesn't travel from Holland to Brazil to Java. He travels from Holland to Brazil, back to Holland, and then from Holland to Java and to China. And then his career meets a sort of untimely end because he gets involved in some weird dealings with some dodgy pearls of dubious provenance, So a lot of these colonial company men like Stamford Raffles would later on get into sort of shady business deals. But they left behind an enormous body of writing. And the interesting thing about Nieuhof's writing is that it's a kind of writing that emerges when we begin to see the beginnings of modern Western scholarship on the non-Western world. The reason why Nieuhof is interesting is because throughout the text, you can feel the strains of realism in it. This is not Pigafetta. There are no accounts of monsters and dragons and what have you, but it is a realist economic understanding of different societies. Once in a while, of course, he slips into fancy. When he talks about Southeast Asia, you come across certain communities that he writes about. There's one community called Kakerlakkens who, for some reason, sleep throughout the day and stay awake all night. Today, we call them students. And then you have the people of Batubara, who appear to be blue-skinned like the characters in the movie Avatar. Now, of course, we know this is not true. So you occasionally have, but the general tone is realist. It's realist because Nieuhof views the world through the lens of a merchant. And that's what gives Nieuhof his mobility. He's not a tourist. He's traveling for a purpose, and the purpose is to fulfill the needs and agendas of the company that he serves, a colonial company. And so this marks, in a sense, the beginnings of modernity, the modern world that we live in today, because this is the beginnings of modern colonial capitalism. And we have the phenomenon of weaponized companies, the East India Company, the British East India Company, the French Compagnie des Indes, corporate entities that have military forces. Nothing like that exists today. It would be like McDonald's with an aircraft carrier. It doesn't happen, right? But in the 17th century, this is the beginnings of economic nationalism, and when economics is seen as a political tool. And it's with that in mind that Nieuhof views Brazil. The reason why I find this book interesting, like I said, is because Churchill has combined Nieuhof's writings on Brazil and his writings on Southeast Asia, Java in particular. And what we have in these works that are interconnected by virtue of having the same author is a particular way of looking at Brazil, a particular way of looking at Java through lens that are not only Eurocentric, because that's undeniable. He is, after all, a Dutchman, he's a European, but also a lens that is economic in nature. So here we have, remember, a merchant who attempts a kind of anthropology as he writes about South American society and Southeast Asian society. And the book is interesting because it is crammed with detail. And this marks the beginning of a kind of modern Orientalist scholarship on the non-Western world. This sets the tone for the writings that will continue for the next 300 years, all the way up to people like John Crawford, Stanford Raffles, and what have you, where these books are basically an accumulation of data. Today, we live in an age where people are worried about data, but data collecting is not new. It goes back to the 17th century. It starts with this need to know the other. But as Nieuhof attempts to know Brazil and to know Java, he's also arranging Brazil. He's arranging Brazilian society according to a typology. And he classifies, the different communities he meets in the same way that he classifies the different products that are there, the different commodities that the company can profit from. And so these societies are not simply seen as societies, but rather as things that the modern, enlightened, rational scientific mind can actually compartmentalize and put into neat categories and assign functions to. This is how it begins. It begins through commerce. And so, in a sense, Nieuhof is a product of his time, because this could be said to be the beginnings of the first globalization, and it's driven by capital. So while in the writings of Nieuhof, we have these very vivid accounts of the different communities, different societies, different ethnic groups that exist in Brazil. Next slide. Next one. Yeah. It also is accompanied by his political commentary, because as Ambassador Prata pointed out, a fact that I think a lot of people in Southeast Asia do not realize is the contested nature of Brazil, and how, different Western colonial forces were at work there, the Dutch and Portuguese and what have you. And while Nieuhof is describing Brazilian society, what really interests him is the position of the Dutch, and can Holland hold on to Brazil? And so the report is then, his report is accompanied by accounts of military campaigns that are going on, the various methods and tactics being used by the Dutch and the Portuguese to somehow gain ground, expand territories. And what's interesting is that this battleground, as Ambassador pointed out, this battleground becomes a multi-ethnic battleground, because these colonial companies rely on local levies who come from different ethnic groups. And so we begin to see then how different ethnic groups later on in the 19th century, understood in terms of racial difference, different races, are put to work in the contestations of empire. And so it's such a political text, and it's a very modern text, even by our standards today. All of this sounds so familiar. It's almost like reading the Wall Street Journal. It's about how fundamentally a modern conflict is actually being fought in the 17th century in Brazil. Next. And of course, again, the commercial mind of Nieuhof, who is a company man, who's there for a purpose. He's there to serve as a functionary of the Dutch West Indies Company, is also looking at what Brazil has to offer and why it's important. And it's important because it fulfills the economic interests of Holland at the time, that's also fighting its own conflicts back in Europe. And I think this is something that many of us keep forgetting, that one of the drivers for what will eventually become Western colonialism is the conflicts in Europe, because each of these countries in Europe are seeking leverage against one another. So as France, Spain, Portugal, England, Holland battle it out in Europe, colonies become important, because that's how you finance your European wars. And so, on the one hand, we have this scientific, rationalist approach, the way in which he surveys the flora and fauna of South America, of Brazil. He looks at the different plants and all that, but everything is immediately turned into dollars, or rather guilders, because then this is important because we can build ships with this. This is important because we can buy guns with this. This is important because this pays for our campaign over there, over there, over there. It's an extraordinary text in the way that it combines what would later become anthropology and sociology as we know it today, but also a realist political rationale that is brutal and cold and calculated, because that's what he's meant to do. He's there for a purpose. He's there to understand the workings of the colony and to ask the question, can the Dutch hold on to Brazil, what they have of Brazil? Next. And of course, in the process of doing this, he maps out Brazilian society, and we see the kind of multiculturalism, the very complex society that has been created in Brazil. But this complex society has been created through the mechanics of colonialism. You know, the movement, the transport of slaves to South America, that basically creates, on the one hand, a florid society, a very complex society, a multicultural society, but underpinning this multiculturalism, this diversity, is the workings of international colonialism, international capital. And that's the thing that brings these communities together. Again, Nieuhof's rational thinking, calculative, strategic mind is trying to figure out, how do we utilize this diversity to actually create sustainable colonies in the long run? Now, from his travels in Brazil, goes back to Holland, and then goes on another long journey to Southeast Asia. Next. 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 And as he, next, these are native Brazilians. Next, and then the journey via Africa, which brings him then to the land of clove trees, and that's the East Indies, Southeast Asia, maritime Southeast Asia.